had actually thought a lot about giving a talk for this work, and I think some artwork sort of stands alone on itself, and some artwork tends to get enriched by context and other references that are influencing it. So I kind of wanted to actually start off maybe by talking about that, and then getting to the pieces themselves. And by the way, please feel free to ask questions. I'm a teacher, and I honestly, as a teacher, I do not want to hear my voice too long and without being interrupted. In fact, one of my former students sitting right there knows exactly what I'm talking about. Although you were probably one of the ones that complained, Mr. Baris, you're talking too much.
But he's here.
Something seems to work. He seems to be doing a lot of crap right now. So, anyway, so that is really what this is about. And so I'd like to start really to try to make some sense of this work. For me, there's kind of really a couple of tributaries, sort of different parts of my life and activities that sort of over the years started to come together. And that's really what the setup was for this work. And the one thing in common with all of them is the idea of space. I just seem to have this obsession with the idea of space. I guess anyone who walks the earth should be obsessed with space. But I think about it in other ways as well. And again, thinking about the lead up to this, and it goes back to childhood. Again, the first images you see there are really shots of fairly disruptive changes of spatial surround that I experienced growing up. I won't go into a long spiel on this, but I was raised on Indian reservations out in the West. My father worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So I basically, my entire life until going to college was in places that were very unpopulated, in some cases out in the middle of, I will go ahead and say it, nowhere, Montana. Various reservations, Sioux Reservation, Crow Reservation, on and on and on. But the point being is that, but even within the reservation type context, even to this day, I still remember one of my first great spatial disruptions. Even at that age, I was very mindful of what a dragger was. And that was the difference from the first picture you see there to the second picture. I was actually, my early childhood, very early, was in the mountains. I was actually born on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State, but really my first real memories were in Northern California, and specifically the Cuba Reservation, of Byzantine, that area. Very mountainous area. We're not talking San Francisco northern. It's much farther north than that. So anyway, so really, when your earlier life is nestled amongst forests and trees, and you literally got things near you all the time, to suddenly be pulled out of there and go to the next slide that you see there in eastern Montana, the land of plains, big sky country. And even to this day, honestly, I don't even like the Jersey coast, quite frankly, because all that open stuff called the ocean, at least in the West, they have hills to your back, but you don't have them here. So to this day, I just have that thing about that open space. So at an early age, I was very mindful of my spatial surround and what that space, my experience of that space. Okay, so that's part of what's going on here. Then, as you can see further, the next slide or the next image you see is really where I went to high school. So it wasn't so much different from the plains. It was in central Washington, Yakima Valley, if you know where apples come from, some of them. And but then from there I went to the big city. Initially it was actually Seattle, the University of Washington. So that was my next big spatial disruption, if you will. Going from a place where really there was not much of a population, and much of my life was hardly anyone lived near me. I mean, I literally lived in places where you could go 100 miles and only see a few people, to suddenly I'm in Seattle, which of course is a metropolitan area city. And so to me that was a big shocker. So anyway, things happen, I move on. Eventually I come to Philadelphia, next picture, which is actually much larger than Seattle. But I came to go to Tyler School of Art, to get a master's, and never left. So that was really just, again, from a biographical feature, that part. Okay, so then eventually I become a teacher and poems while I'm an artist, obviously, because because I went to art school and would hope I would be an artist at this point. But one of my big fascinations as a teacher was just basically the art history in general, but specifically spatial systems that have been designed and developed around the world through history. It's always fascinating that a pictorial space was so radically different if you were looking at an Egyptian picture, for lack of a better word, versus Byzantine, versus a Roman, versus whatever. So that becomes sort of a lifelong obsession for me, and a lot of it I bring to my teaching as well. So in the course of that, I've then started really studying all kinds of things. In fact, one of the slides here is kind of a, for lack of a better word, I'll call it a book, but I would never truly publish it, because to publish it, I would have to get rights to so many images that would never happen. But it was something I've done for myself, and I use in the teaching capacity. But basically, I'm just showing you some samples of that to give you an idea that leads to this work. Truly understanding kind of on an intellectual, but visual intellectual level, really why different cultures, their space is so different. Why when you go to, let's say, the Japanese or a Chinese, or I'll just say Far Eastern section of your local museum, why those images just feel so different than when you just left when you're, let's say, in the a medieval period or much less a Renaissance European type spaces. So anyway, so in doing that, really trying to deconstruct that and understand that, a lot of my attention, a lot more happened too, but really I'm just focusing on one part, and those are the projection systems. So you can see on one of these, this little diagram, these are the basic geometries that different cultures have used. For example, a great deal of the kind of, you see a landscape with structures, both Japanese and Chinese. I'm talking about traditional, obviously. Nowadays you can see it. All the cultures are influenced by other cultures and such. For the most part, they have oblique projection. Okay, and again, that's there. I'm not going to explain it at this point. Other cultures have orthogonal, and then of course there's convergent. We all are used to that. We're tied into the Renaissance. That's called linear perspective. That's a convergent perspective. Totally unknown to most other cultures. So basically, so the next few images are just examples of me studying how space works. Including, for example, the one on this side here, nominalistic perspective. It's really one of my real loves in terms of research, and I've done a lot of traveling, I've got travel grants and stuff, is the Byzantine world. Don't ask me why, because if you look at my work, you would wonder, what? This guy couldn't be further from the Byzantine. But yet, it has to be mine. In fact, quite frankly, I think a lot of it is actually hideous. Okay, but I love it, Okay, this is a weird, obviously I have a strange relationship to it. And some of it's quite beautiful. But of course, when we refer to the Byzantine, we're talking about many centuries and some cases that much less different geographical manifestations of it. But basically, the whole thing about Byzantine art in general, and to some extent the Western Middle Ages, there was stuff that was going on there too, but more the Byzantine. The idea of anomalous projection, the fact that they have multiple systems all placed into one image. Okay, you can see, I realize that's a tiny image, but really if you look at it closely, you can see there's actually several happening at the same time. And keep in mind, this was a culture that inherited the ancient world, and the Romans themselves practically had a convergent system. So it wasn't like they did not know how to create a deep rational space, but they clearly chose not to do it as a culture. And of course, one of the major theory for that reason, and I'm just saying this and I want to move on, is the fact that, I mean, eventually, of course, different artists may or may not have been capable of doing it, but as a cultural phenomenon, it was actually probably purposeful. Why? Because they were being dogged by iconoclasm. They were being dogged by these powerful forces that were basically saying the second commandment, buddy, you shouldn't even be doing images of deities, right? So they needed to come up with a perspective, or excuse me, a spatial system that screwed you up spatially, so it was another world, right? Because the Renaissance, they're all about putting you, oh, it's just like it's real. They had to make it look like it was otherworldly. So my point being here is that they just completely messed with you on the perspective system. They literally merged different ones into a single image. And that is why so much Byzantine imageries and icons and stuff are so mysterious to the average Westerner. Because they go, what was it with these people? couldn't they figure out how to, you know? And I'm saying, no, they knew exactly what they were doing, and they had actually good reasons for it theologically. So anyway, so the point being is that, obviously, think of my biography, yeah, think of this obsession. Now we're going to move along with something closer to the work we have here. Okay, by the way, I've just put this page here, just these are not pieces in this actual show, but it's just knowing what I've just said about how I'm using geometry to create different spatial experience or virtual experience. You can see both of these pieces, perhaps you can anyway, where I'm doing it purposefully. And by the way, when I do a painting, and that's true for anything here, don't get me wrong here, I'm not that smart, and I'm not that intellectual, I may seem that way, but when I actually go into the painting, I'm just doing stuff. So if things do whatever they do in terms of angles, in terms of diagonals, in terms of whatever, it's not because I said to myself, oh, it's high time to have some little perspective here, you know what I mean? I just do it, okay? Some of them work differently than others, it's just that I've been kind of working that for so long, it just comes natural to me to do whatever I do. So anyway, before moving on, I'm just gonna, a lot of people would ask, and by the way, feel free to break into your question. You can even ask me my favorite color if you'd like. Just let you know I don't have one. So anyway, in the meantime, of course, I look at other artists too. It's not like all my influences are from reservations or playing around with Byzantine paintings. So clearly, I mean, so I've brought, really 3 artists that are very important to me in terms of, I think, that really influence kind of the direction of my work, along with these other influences, are Stuart Davis. Again, just kind of that wacky geometry, and a lot of them, again, I'm not going to go on a long spiel about his work. I can never say his name right. I'm sorry, but I always blow it. Let's see. Someone in the room can go ahead and say it. And Calder. In fact, I'm not going to lead you into the back room, but a lot of the stuff that you would see in the back room is probably a direct line from Calder's work. For example, this man, you can see that one down there, what I call the nested forms series, that kind of whole aesthetic is really, I consider it direct influence on that. There's others are a little bit more. So again, a lot of my work is on plexiglass, nothing you're seeing right here, but again, that's really a major feature of my work. And in here, for example, one of the images here is a project room I did several years ago. So it's just, so you can see one of those, a couple of those, quite frankly, they're pretty large, massive sheets of plexiglass. So, by the way, they're bulletproof. You should know that. And they were given to me by a friend who actually literally was did a lot of real estate. Tore down buildings, built new buildings, sold them, that kind of thing, in an area of Philadelphia that I would say would be kind of equivalent to the Bushwick of New York, up and coming hipster kind of area, right? Anyway, he happened to be demolishing a building that was a check cashing place. Okay. In fact, if you look very closely here, there's a little notch on the bottom.
So is this scratch?
That's where you put your money.
Oh, yeah. Actually, something like that. Yes.
That's funny.
Oh, yeah, so you can imagine.
Work that way of gallery.
Right, so you can imagine all the money that slipped through there. Right. How much got ripped? People got ripped off probably of the interest rates or the exchange rates or whatever it was, the rates that they were being over. But so that was really actually that was a new thing. It was the first time I really worked with plexiglass like that. But so what you see in the other room, the long shelf with 7 panels on it, which happens to be called the stations of the cube. There's my little Byzantine thing coming out a little bit here and tongue in cheek, but that really is coming out of this group, and you can see another example here. So again, the same idea. I'm working geometries, shapes, and really taking them very seriously of what spatial experience they're suggesting. But of course, with plexiglass, there's so many other things. It's hardly just geometry, at least I like to think it's not. It's about the material that it's on, the effects of light on that, and what's going on. So anyway, so that was kind of explains a little bit about the work that's in the other room. Again, I'd be happy to talk about it in more detail. Okay, and then sort of the final chapter that truly does lead up to this work, and in fact this work is about in some ways, is my German Archipelago project. Okay, so back up a little bit. Little Stevie, coming from the little worlds out west, okay, comes to the big city, out to the big back east, right? Lives in Philadelphia, and after a while gets a job in the suburbs of Philadelphia teaching, and has children, and because of those children, he finds himself in his car a lot. Places a lot. Okay, forever, for some years anyway. And the craziest places, people, especially because it was a private school I taught and my kids were able to go there, it meant that their friends could be from almost anywhere. They were down the block, okay? So I found myself going into these areas way west of the city, beyond the suburbs, what are actually called the exurbs. That's an official word. That was a word going back in the 1950s, actually. Again, they are the suburbs, you know, whereas the suburbs are still part of the city in a way. Think about it. You've got the original urb, and then the population, there's concentric circles of things, but they're still center-oriented, right? They're still oriented toward that center. They still kind of look toward those tall buildings in the middle of that city there. And so everyone who lives there knows where they are relative to a center. But this Serbia, which my project is called, is based on a completely different spatial logic. The Serbia is no mystery. It's completely based on the highway systems that were started in the 1950s, okay? So from the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, they started building highways everywhere. And we started getting what we know today to be these networks of highways that are basically crisscrossing the former countryside. And so Serbia, basically, any kind of, or most developments in Serbia have nothing to do with the central city anymore. They're beyond suburbs. They are at the networks or the nodes in those networks where major expressways cross. So think about it. Most development is where there's two major expressways are crossing, and that's where you're going to see much of it, or nearby. So that was the world I was driving into. And I was just fascinated by it. I mean, actually, kind of sort of disgusted by it on some level, because for me, from where I came from, this was just a really weird space to be in. I was lost all the time. This is pre-GPS. But at the same time, it was really fascinating to me. So, again, I'm one of these people that gets fascinated with what I'm held by. Don't worry.
My lips are sealed.
Not in my personal life. We're just talking space here. So anyway, so that led to my little project called the German Archipelago. And that all started with me being really amazed by these things, and what really fascinated me were these huge buildings that I started to notice popping up. Just literally, in some cases, I'd go to this birthday party one year. Guess what? The kid had a birthday party the next year too, but this time there was a giant building there, okay, called distribution centers, or often known as logistics centers, or my favorite, fulfillment centers. So it was kind of uplifting. So anyway, again, not to go into any detail, I think you guys probably know what I'm talking about. I mean, anyone that certainly goes up the New Jersey Turnpike from Philadelphia down to Washington, D.C., I mean, it's just hint. Look to your left, look to your right, and you'll just can see them. And honestly, most of them have been built in the last few years. They're just exploding everywhere. So to me, I was just fascinated by, again, space, right? I'm fascinated by landscape, because landscape is a form of spatial expression. Landscape is an actual land itself, and then we use the word landscape for the artistic portrayal of it as well. So anyway, so at the time, my own work wasn't really that, although I could. But yet those influences, like I was saying earlier, set me up to respond to that eventually. But at this point, they're kind of parallel courses going on. So anyway, so I started this web project called the German Archipelago, and this is the kind of the page I did. And really, at this point, some of it was about taking photographs and all that kind of stuff of actual sites. But at this point, the bulk of it was just going on to Google Earth and just basically having a good old times going all over the world, particularly this region, I should say. And oh my God, look at all this. There's a cluster of distribution centers, zooming in like a bird. taking screen grabs, and then I'm pretty handy with Photoshop and Illustrator and all those programs. In fact, I teach them. So basically what you see eventually are not only pictures of the actual, in this case, a really classic bay. That's what they are. They're just massive buildings that are set up in truck bays, because that's what they're there for. So trucks to come, trucks to go, distribute stuff. And this is what they look like. This is a bit of class. I mean, I got millions of these shots. This particular one, I'm sure you're interested to know, was just south of Wilmington. So when you're in Wilmington, go south and you'll find it for yourself. So again, these are the kinds of things I was doing for a while there. And my whole web project was really just a collection of these things. Plus, it's still there, so if you really want to know everything there is to know about Serbia, go to my site, go to the project page, and go to German Archipelago, and if you really have a lot of time on your hands, you can read this giant fake interview I wrote. I figured, no one wants to be lectured to, so I can kind of make it funny, as if I'm being interviewed at a major museum show, and in the course of this, make myself sound a little bit like a geek, but ultimately giving the information out. So there you go. Go check it out when you have the time. So anyway, so that really has become a big thing, and it's ongoing. This is not something that is over with. So anyway, over time, the paintings themselves started to kind of slip into those forms. They became kind of that form language that the work happened to be on. Before that, I was doing a lot of kind of somewhat hard-edged work, but it was more fields of forms. It was not so much compositionally based kind of stuff like I had with real discrete forms. So really, that's what's led up to the work you're seeing here. In fact, just to finish off with this, and then we can put this down. I guess in many ways, at least up until now, the peak of this whole end of my work was a show that I had at the DCCA last summer. That's the Delaware Center for the Contemporary Arts in Wilmington. And it was a wonderful opportunity, kind of a museum, not a commercial gallery kind of thing, more of a museum type venue. And basically I was given the green light to just do whatever I wanted to, and really it was a nice opportunity to not be oriented toward painting, although I had a couple paintings. In fact, that painting was in it. But so for this one, it was a multimedia project. I had a giant game board. In fact, you can see it in this picture. That's actually this. It was huge. Played the game. Well, take a load off. And it was really this game about trucks that go into Serbia and you have to unload them. And the winner is the first one that gets all 25, stopped at all 25 distribution centers and all those under the chip, wins the game. But in the course of doing that, you go through this absolutely hellish world. And good luck getting through it. It takes a lot longer. In fact, I got to tell you, and Linda can testify, this is actually the fourth game board I've designed in my life, and I've never played one of them. I hate game boards. Remember what I said about I'm attracted to what I'm repelled by? Game boards. I hate them. As a kid, I just hated it when the families are on vacation and Steve, we need you to play Parcheesi. Oh God, it's terrible, right? So I finally had to play it because we went down with my son, who was working, can't be here today, and his fiance was not his fiance at the time, and they love game boards, and so they forced me to play it. So I just want you to know, I want the world to know that I, the person who designed this game, played it, and I lost. I was the last, I was fourth place.
Was it fun?
Yeah, I had a good time. But literally, I lost. I couldn't believe that I was not only did not win, but I was 4 out of 4 in my own game board. But anyway, basically there's I did a huge wall thing. This is cool. It was so fun. I love scale, honestly. If I could do large scale, I would just do it all the time. This happened to be 14 feet by 48 feet, so it was really fun to do. Just cool.
In what materials did you use?
Basically, it was just latex paint. The people there at the DCCA prepared it for me with a base pink. And then I showed up with all my little cardboard templates that I had already worked out with a grid system, and they had one of these lift things. Which, God, that's amazing. I did not blow a hole into that wall. Blow up and down, my head almost hit the thing. But it was fun. I had actually a great time making it. So anyway, the thing here is just a video that I did, just a loop point being is that this whole German Archipelago is a real fascinating and fun project that I'm into and I'm just fascinated by it. So thus the paintings, which have been happening all along. So here we go. As you can see around the room, my work is medium-wise. Everything here is oil. Everything on plexiglass is not that it has to be, but for whatever reason, there are reasons I decided that acrylic is the better material to work with on that.
And what is the reason?
What is the reason? God, it's always someone would ask me. What is the reason? Damn, I know there are reasons for that. It's the surface. It's just something and also everything on plexiglass is so clean and austere. And for some reason I can make that happen better with acrylic. But this stuff is, for lack of a better word, more painterly. And also the colors, I realize the acrylic world has come a long way than it used to be, but I'm still, when it comes to the nuances of color, I just feel more comfortable with oil. I just can't. So whereas if you notice all the ones in there are pretty straightforward. I mean, some of them are literally just white, Also the kind of finishes I can make on them. But again, I've done oil on acrylic, on plexiglass before, so it's not like I have some hard fast rule in my mind. Everybody touches oil to it. I mean, even if it wasn't oil, I would put acrylic on first. I just don't think it's probably good to have oil touching the plexiglass to begin with. So, but whatever. But everything in here is oil on whatever the surface is, and these are Mylars, and I will say Mylar for me is that's my go-to material. That's my homeland. I mean, if I'm working new ideas, it's always going to be on Mylar. Many years ago, somebody sold me a roll of Mylar for $800. At the time, I hardly had any money. I don't know why I did it. I couldn't even carry it. People carry it. Oh, this industrial roll. And I still have it at this point. It's still there. It's getting small. I'm really actually getting kind of nervous that I'm getting closer to the end. You know what I mean? It's like, is this the end of my life? So every time I go out to pull some more off, what am I going to do after this? Anyway, so these are all cut from that roll. But again, my point being, God, well, that was the smartest buy I ever did in my life. So I've done just tons and tons of them. That's just always, not always in this particular, as you can see, I'm very much in love with a square format. And the reason I like square formats is because, again, I'm so conscious of spatial structures that I don't want any format that lends itself to a landscape or to a portrait, period. I want it to be so neutral that whatever happens in there does its free floating just as it is. A diagonal will work differently in a square format, in my opinion, than it will be in any other non-square format. So that's why you see everything is square. So that's the format question. Someone's asking a question.
And you begin with these grids that are underneath, and do you do that and Mylar with oil or a different material?
Now you're asking, do I do the grids with oil?
Yes.
Different ways I've done grids. Usually what I do is I'll just start building up color. First of all, I do a lot of layers. I'm a layer guy. I'd say a typical painting here probably has 20 to 30 layers of color easily. So much so that literally a lot of these colors were completely different colors at some point. And so if you think about putting layers of somewhat transparent color, as you can see, it's very thin. I don't go thick paint never goes on any of these pieces. To go from, let's say, a dark blue to a pink means a lot of layers. So again, it's layer, 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 layer. So even before forms come on, usually I'm just building the ground. That's it. I just want to play with it. At some point, and by the way, I don't always have the grids. I guess probably may well be the case here, but by no means do I always have grids.
The grid is very handmade. It's not.
Yes, it's just. And to answer your question, initially when I was doing grids, they were litho pencils. I actually used to be a printmaking person. I actually went to Tyler as a printmaking major. It's amazing how many printmaking techniques. I still use brayers all the time. Litho pencil because I did lithography a lot, so it's the same thing. So when I first started started doing it, I was using litho pencils on one layer, and then I'd put another layer on top of it, and then I'd use the litho pencil as a what in the printmaking world we called a resist, and I'd literally go in with solvent. And so wherever there was a litho pencil, actually it exposes the color underneath. But that was with the greasier lithos, and then I started going to the non-greasier lithos and just worked them. But in all cases, there's no question there's transparent paint on top of it. I don't think I've ever had that.
Have you tried any of these images in woodblock? Because I could never see this in woodblock.
I haven't woodblock in a long time, but I did have a little period of woodblock way back when. It's an interesting, yeah, you're right, it's an interesting thought because I'm, as I'm sure you are too, very sensitive to just the nuance of a line and how you make that line work. And of course, it's all about resistance or lack of resistance of the material is what that line's going to be. But yeah, these are definitely, clearly I like the grid just simply because I like the presence of a grid because it empowers diagonals, right? If you got a square format and then you essentially redouble that with a grid, which is really a ton of squares, right? And then you throw a diagonal into that. I just love diagonals. I mean, it's all about diagonals. Where are you going to put them? Because when going back to those spatial projections, it's all about the presence and manipulation of diagonals or the lack of diagonals, depends on what culture you're looking at. So that's a little spill into it. So yeah, so litho pencil for the most part. It's funny that you should say that. I just started working. Everyone was saying to me, Steve, they got these great acrylic pencil-y things. I don't know what they're actually called, but now they're like pencils. I mean, there's acrylic ink coming out of like a crayon. I don't know even what you call it, but literally I've been working with that lately. I love it actually. I just love the resistance that it has on its surface. A little different with pencil. So yeah, you're right. All of these do have these anyway. All do have grids, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're there. But if I'm putting them there, my intellectual reason is what I just told you. The whole thing on diagonals, but the real reason is I just like them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, look at this painting, because it's looking at us. The three questions about the shapes, the density of that black, the density, the mattness, all that is just really, it has a remarkable presence. And then the edges are both, they seem handmade, they're not taped.
Right.
And they also has this, that red one is interesting, there's this sort of glow along the edge, and it seems like perhaps, it's rubbed or somehow that you get, so process and...
No, it's a great question because here's how I work forms. Usually, but let's just say it's a typical Mylar, it's a typical Thursday afternoon. I will go in and I mean, this kind of working, I never have a preset, certainly on Mylar, I will never have a preset anything. I'm truly an improvisational worker at that point. I just start slapping a color, maybe it's brown, maybe it's black, maybe it could be any color. Often it's just a bunch of paint that's sitting, it's going to go to waste if I don't start using it off of my palette. And I'll just start to take a brush and just put shapes all over, just rough, crazy shapes. They're not even geometric really at that point. And then the key for me are blades. I mean, when I say blades, I'm talking about a taper. Somebody who's taping a wall, the blades, there's different bits of them. I have my students full of those. And basically, it's that in one hand, a rag in another hand. I love rags. So if anyone has extra soft cotton t-shirts on today because it's hot, they want to take it off, leave it with me. I'm doing them all the time. I go through them. I guarantee it's going to look like hell by the time I'm through with it. It'll be cleaner. But I use that to wipe off. So that's the other thing. I'm very reductive oriented. I love to reduce myself to the forms, not add to. I can draw. I'll do a lot of drawing sometimes. It's just studies. I can think these forms with a drawing and then maybe convert them. But for the most part, I can only think them by reducing to them. So I'm constantly reducing. I might screw up and then add some more paint and then go back in. But what I'm essentially doing is I got a blade in my hand, I got a rag, and I just literally wipe it off. Then at a certain point, I'm probably taking that brayer I mentioned, the rolling thing. Because as you can see, there's very little brush strokes here. I want this to be as flat as possible. And that's, so usually at some point I'm taking rollers, and sometimes I'm cleaning up the rollers. Sometimes I'm very loosey-goosey in if you've ever used a brayer on stuff, it'll sort of leave marks off on the edge. Sometimes I clean it up, sometimes I don't. So a lot of the stuff you're seeing here, like like this right here, absolutely, that's from a rare. That on one of probably 20 passes over that. I'm sure that block probably had at least 20, maybe more times I put paint on that. So it's going over and over. It's not just one shot. So that over time, of course, you're going to get, especially if my ideal is not even to be perfect. You can imagine you're going to get slight differences. And I like that because I like those forms that kind of vibrate. They feel like they're hard edged. They feel like they should be quite circumscribed in a very literal way, but in fact, if you get up close, they kind of don't look, they're not really sure where their edge is. And that gives them, to me anyway, more of a dynamic vibration, the way it interacts with its field, with its ground. Yeah, that's how I work with most of those things. And so really, the next question I'm sure you're all ready to ask is all those crazy lines everywhere. Well, guess what? That just, often I've got big long things and there's paint on them and I'm using the wipe here, but it's left paint over there. Sometimes I'm just nuts, sometimes I'm in a foul mood. Whatever. In some cases, these things could be coming from a form that existed that I've painted over. That's the other thing. There could be plenty of forms in these things that you don't even see anymore, particularly canvases. Less so with somewhat, but less so with Mylar, because Mylar itself is so transparent that there's only so much opacity you can take to that before it starts to get at least for me, it's it for me. So that's where all the lines are coming from.
So if you're doing graying, are you working to get the canvas on the wall and then stretch it later? Or how?
Oh, no, I stretch it right off the bat. No, it's always stretched.
So that the brayer doesn't kind of just
Push. Well, I stretch the hell out of this stuff. I mean, I'm fairly tight for that very reason, yeah. In fact, when I guess this is only going to be interesting to those people who stretch canvases. So the rest of you can talk to each other for 30 seconds. I actually, you know how you have the crossbars and stuff on the canvases? I remove all those while I'm working and I actually put other wood across the back. I mean, it's still being supported, but it's back that far.
Yes.
Because if I put it right there behind it, I'd be constantly hitting that. It would create its own lines, and I don't want those lines. And so after the thing is finished, then I remove those and replace them with actual whatever I replace them with. Yep. So the combination of stretching quite tight to begin with, and then putting the actual crossbars and replacing them is how you get away. That's a good question, though. You know, so those who were talking to their people should listen to them after all. Do you have a question, Linda?
About the grid, I mean, you kind of answered it, but I was thinking more of, metaphorically, that the grid, I mean, you said that it sets up, a kind of counterpoint to the diagonals, but I was wondering if there was any sort of metaphorical thing about the sense of the exurban space being a network as opposed to an urban center, if that's going on as well.
Yeah, but there's irony on that one. It's actually paradoxical because on the one hand, you think of the grid as the ultimate of control, right? Once humankind started to understand grid, once they mapped the world in terms of grid, that's all about ability to turn land into sites. A site, right? A site is what architects would talk about. You know, they flatten everything. And with a grid, you can now start to create a built world. Okay? So the grid's always associated with that, associated with ultimate order, which of course is what really I'm fascinated about. With, the whole. When I talk about the landscape full of distribution centers, I'm really talking about a landscape with these buildings. Okay, so it's not just the buildings themselves, but their relationship to each other and to this land that they're inhabiting. Quite frankly, the relationship that to me is fascinating is just how they don't seem to belong there, how they seem to float above it almost. I mean, they're so big, often they're so white, and they're so without windows. They're just so otherworldly that, there's some buildings like you look at a typical barn, you just feel like it's part of the landscape, right? It just grew up with the landscape somehow, and usually there's trees next to it. But these things, they just felt like they just came down from the sky and they just plopped, and they weren't even fully plopped, they're still hovering a little bit. So therefore, it's a floating world that I'm interested in here. By the way, very much like what people refer to as Japanese and to a large extent Chinese landscapes too. If you look at them, there's a sense of a floating world, unlike a Western landscape, things are solidly underground. To me, that floating quality. So I realize I've come a long way with your question about the grid. So on the one hand, it's all about order, but on the other hand, exurb is about disorder. I mean, the fact that you can't find anything. You're in New York, with the exception of Broadway, all you have to do is turn right or turn left. You're in a grid, right? It's easy. Go to a place like Seattle, for example, where I lived for many years, you know. There's areas where there's just no grid. Or go to Istanbul. Love getting lost in Istanbul, by the way. Or many cities, I mean, ancient cities that have no grids, right? They're just about, you're constantly lost. It's very difficult to orient yourself to anything there. So the irony is I'm using a grid here, and maybe that's why I don't want them straight, because I still want them a little squiggly too, because the world I'm talking about is amazingly disoriented. And that's one of the big factors about it. I'm just, again, it's one of these fascination and repel kind of obsessions of mine. I'd love to be lost. Unless I actually have to be somewhere. But seriously, it's wow, what is it about this place that's why I have no clue where I'm going? Who would have designed a world that would have disoriented people that much? And really, you feel pretty quickly that you're not supposed to be there, and that's actually the case. So.
It just feels so much like it's woven. I think more of weaving than a grid.
Right.
Yeah.
Which
It's
really
got
weaving
that
is a grid, it's just a
soft,
tighter.
But
just
it
a
also
tighter
has
mesh.
that pliability.
Mhm.
I don't know what you think of with the grid.
Textile.
Yeah.
Which I think, now that you mention it, and by the way, I'm in my mind taking notes for my next artist statement. Act retroactively like I actually intended that all along. But no, seriously, I think that what you're referring to does make that surface come to life more. You know, if I would have kept that straight, it just would have been like a mechanical drawing, would have been dead. Absolutely any
It also has so many more references when
Mhm.
when it's like this.
Right, because of weaving,
Yeah.
right, which is again the primordial human organism, way of creating something, yeah.
Taking it a step further from a non-artist perspective, I can see a whole line of pillows coming up.
Except I don't know how
Exorbitant
easy being
pillows.
able to sell these pillows with straight edges like that. You know, people tend to not like to put their heads on words. You never know, I guess you can make things soft. So this work here, for example, is sort of a slightly more recent, although a lot of my work is, and the piece over there, and what I'm referring to are these lines. That's where the Geometries of Flow as a title started to come in, is when I started adding that to it, because I realized one of the paradoxes I was dealing with here with distribution centers and networks is that on the one hand, they're very classical geometric rectilinear forms for the most part, which what could be more stationary than that? And yet their entire purpose is circulation. It's about the circulation of goods and services as quickly as possible. That's the whole idea of those distribution centers. The fact that something can come off of a ship in Elizabeth, New Jersey on Monday, be in a distribution center on Tuesday, be in a store on Wednesday, and be in your living room the next day. That's called circulation of money and everything. So it's all about circulation. So the idea of flow, that's really that. And think about it. That's what the whole concept of expressway system, which is created in Serbia. Serbia is just a child of the expressways. It was about flow. It's about how can you get as many people to go as fast as possible. This flow as fast as possible through your what once was a countryside. So anyway, obviously I'd like it visually, or I would have done it. I never would have just made some form because it just illustrated some intellectual thought of mine. As much as intellectually as I can sound, I really don't think intellectually when I paint. I respond first and foremost to the forms, the colors. Does it just feel right to me? But for whatever reason, I started adding these to my pieces, and it just really reinforced that flow quality that something's moving from someplace to someplace else. So that's really illustrated in that one right there as well. Not all of them I do it, sometimes. Often I'll try, because, once I get into somewhere I think is really hip, I'll think, oh my God, I should do it on all of them. But, suddenly you'll be on one, and you know what, there's no place for that to happen, so we'll just keep it like this. This is what it should be, so that would be the case on that.
It almost feels, now I'm looking at it differently here, it almost feels to me like it brings it to, from the built world to almost a human scale. I mean, there's something about a digestive tract or something. Which signifies flow as well, but it seems to be a sort of internal rather than external I'm sorry, now nobody's going to be able to look at it. A stomach, but.
Yeah, the fingers are intestines, thank you.
That would be your sidekick here, move things in the right direction. Sorry.
But again, as you can see, a lot of pieces, and again, there's this, and of course these large canvases here, which
Talking about the nesting form pieces in the grid, those are very interesting.
yeah, that's again, those are the ones that are, and you can see the blue one, is there another one in the other background? I can't remember, or it's just that blue one's here, whatever. But I've done a bunch of
This
them.
one inside the
There
office.
is, that's right,
Right.
okay. How did I get to those? God, I'm just trying to remember how I even started. I mean, obviously, it should be obvious that the basic form language is already there, right? I didn't look into that. The question, I guess, is what made me think of cutting a piece of plexiglass into an odd shape? And by the time this talk is over, I hope to remember why I said it. I honestly can't remember what made me think of those. But basically, I just bought big sheets of, well, now it's been 2 or 3 big sheets of plexiglass, and then I usually do those by working with drawings on some kind of cardboardy or mat board material, and I'll just draw for a while until I see forms, and then I'll start, then I'll cut them out and use them as a template, and then I just with a saw, I will saw these shapes of plexiglass out, sand them down, start to paint them. But of course, the big thing going on with those things is the fact that you have a nested form. You have one form nested inside of another form, and that really was the heart and soul, and still is, of that series. And they're all pretty much, they all have a metallic shape in them. Okay, so again, you see that blue one over there. The blue is acrylic, and it's always going to be somewhat transparent. I want the color to feel like, I wouldn't say watery, but I'd like to sense that you could enter in, that there's an interior space that you can penetrate that plexiglass surface inside to. Okay? Whereas if I made them fully opaque, I don't think you would feel that, right? But everything works better with contrast, right? I mean, hot is hotter if it's next to cold, on and on and on. We all know that contrast will make things more vivid than what they are. And so I always like to put these metallic surfaces. And by the way, this definitely comes from my fascination with Byzantine art, because after years and years of just studying Byzantine, they were the masters of metallic surfaces and mixing metallic with non-metallic. So to see, after about 10,000 icons, when you've seen a spot over here, maybe just a halo, maybe something else, a few spots of, wow, what's going on with this gold leaf or silver, and yet everything else is this tempera or perhaps oil later piece. I just always fascinated with the juxtaposition of a metallic surface, because a metallic surface is just so impenetrable. I mean, really, it just wants to come back at you. Light does crazy things on it, depending on the light. It can look dark, and then the next second, light within one swath of light, the same surface will go from light to dark. Whatever the case, it's impenetrable. And so you put an impenetrable metallic surface and you nest that shape into another larger shape that is watery, that is transparent. The two, hopefully, if it works, will play off of each other. So those nested forms is really about one shape sort of defining another one. The big one defines the little one, but the little one's redefining the big one. So I'm trying to create a tension between those two forms. Some resolution's kind of happening too, but the two are fighting each other at the same time. So they're fighting each other both in their shapes, but also in that surface. So the surface is really important. I often call it silver, but it's not silver. It's some kind of steel acrylic paint. Which I now know why I use acrylic paint. Who asked me earlier why I would use acrylic paint on this thing? Somebody just did. And remember, I didn't know. And remember, I promised I would know by the end of the session. That's why I do it. Because all the metallic paints and oil paints suck. I hate them. I've never found an oil paint metallic that works. It's just weird. It does. Whereas for one, there's a couple great brands of metallic paint and acrylic that work much better. That is why I went to acrylic. That's why. Otherwise, there was no reason why I wouldn't have been oil, actually. But it's just for that particular thing. So, yeah. Yes.
Steven, we have some nested forms
Yes.
inside your 2D work.
Absolutely.
Mylar paintings.
Mhm.
Which one affected which?
That's a good question. I think I'm going to play the easy, cheap answer and say they came simultaneously, and I think they did. I really do. I don't think one, I mean, maybe one was before the other, but I wouldn't remember what that was. But they really come, the idea of placing, nesting a form within another form. Again, think of geometric projections. Think, if you're really going to base an entire image on its geometry, right? It's an implicit space that the projection, the projected geometry will imply. So if you nest one form that's in one projective system inside of another form that's in another projective system, basically the receiver of that image is kind of screwed up, right? I mean, you don't know what to do. And that would be called anomalous projection, right? Because now and that's actually kind of where I want my paintings to be. I really want them to kind of suggest them. They can take you into a deep space, but they'll never take you into a deep space because we're always going to fly back on the surface. And all my color choices, or I should say most of them, at the end of the day, are really about screwing with your sense of space. I will do whatever I can do to send that paint right back to the surface, regardless of whatever else I'm telling you to do. So basically I'm saying, watch it go off with the great virtual distance of my painting. Of course, the moment you try, you smash it at the surface. You won't do it. In many ways for me, and again, I'm kind of going a little poetic on here now. It's not like I really design paintings to say this, but I do feel that world of exurban kind of is that way. It's kind of like, just not a very romantic space for the most part, that 19th century sensible landscape. Think about it. Think about the 19th century landscapes. There's this romance of distance. There's almost this allure of distance. Whereas really, when you're in a world of distribution centers, these hugely oversized, overskilled buildings that are so massive, they don't go into a distance. They come flying up at you. It's weird. And if you've actually, like me, gone into those complexes of them, it's very strange spatially. Really, it's just a different kind of space. That's all I can say. Maybe I should start a tourist agency. Gray Line Tours. Gray Line, the Exurbia. We can all just drive off and look at famous distribution centers. But, yeah.
Just to say, it's interesting, looking at this more, these paintings are actually dominated by the empty space, not the objects. And to go back to where you started the whole talk, and your experience of empty spaces, that whether it is in some way to sneak in your love of that, and the shapes call attention to themselves.
Yes.
But eventually they, I find myself looking into the pale blue-green here,
Right.
much more so.
Yeah, right. I do not suffer from, I don't know how the official Latin expression is for vacuum. How do you really say it? Fear of vacuum. Yeah, like the Minoans are known for that. They really fill their spaces up. I do not suffer from that. I do like it. And by the way, that would be very much a Far East Asian sensibility, both Chinese and Japanese and the others as well. Those are the two great landscape traditions that are in love with negative space, big open spaces. I can't claim I come from there, though. I'd love to give you some biography that somehow I grew up in China, but I did not.
But you grew up in the plains.
I grew up in the plains, yeah. Although spending many years in Seattle, there's no question Seattle very much has especially a Japanese influence going on. A lot of Japanese gardening and stuff has happened in Seattle, so who knows, maybe it came that way. But you're right. In fact, I'm very mindful of those negative spaces, and I do try to charge them if I can. In other words, make them not dead.
Yeah.
So, for example, this just happened. I didn't think my way through it, but sort of as I was developing this piece, this little notch right here sort of points up to this notch up here. I didn't really think about it until I was working for a while, but by doing that, it just suddenly, this zone, it just like charged, it's where something's happening, even though nothing's happening there. But yeah, there's no question. I put a lot of stock in what those spaces are doing. If they don't feel right, then the painting isn't there yet. I don't care how cool the shape is.
There's always almost something animated about it as well. In a conveyor belt sense, things entering and exiting off the edges.
Yeah. In fact, I would say but definitely these two. So in many ways, remember I said this to me became kind of the first thing that signaled to me that really these are about geometry and they're about flow. If I can try to square that circle to get geometry to feel like it flows. But the other way is sort of just the composition of the forms. They feel like they're just flowing. They're topsy-turvy. One's coming from another one in their screwy, anomalous geometrical lives. So really those two in particular very much. In fact, the most recent group of which really these two are part too, although some of my Mylars are more blatant. A new title series. And by the way, I do a lot of work. I'm pretty prolific, so if I actually had to come up with a cute title for every time I had to do a title, it would be crazy. I just couldn't do it. So I like to have a series. So I'll just have a series of blah, 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 number 1, number 2, number 3, number whatever, you see what I mean? And it'll stay on that series until I feel like a shift has occurred and something's a little different, and then it's time for a new title. So therefore, the Geometries of Flow came after, what are these ones again? The last title was.
Rhizomes.
Somewhere.
Rhizomes, thank you very much. See, it's great to have a wife.
Many reasons. There's also the somewhere behind your wall.
Yes, well, there's that whole series too, which
Yeah.
we've actually shown in this gallery, which I made a point not to bring up simply because, to be honest with you, I really am fearful that people think I'm so schizo because I have so many different things going on. You know, you're not seeing all the things I'm doing. I mean, I even told you I do board games and other videos and stuff like that. So therefore, I'm kind of fearful that I try to edit myself because I just start covering all the bases that I'm doing. You're just kind of like, God, what is this guy's problem? Can you focus? Yes, there's one series called Somewhere Behind or Beyond. Okay, and in all this, by the way, you can go to my website and also on the gallery's website. Both cases, you'll see examples of those pieces, and they're very little color in those pieces. There might be a spot color, but they're really about these bars, and really they lend themselves exactly to this kind of bar, except the whole thing is a series of structure, but a little more structural. So that's one series. Okay, so there was no question when I landed on that it needed its new title. It had that. So then it was that's been going on, and that's ongoing, by the way. I'm still working on those. I rarely just do a series and just stop it and move on to something else. Basically, I do a series until I get bored, and then I do something else until I get bored, and then I go back to the other series and continue on because by then I'm interested again. Anyway, so anyway, the most recent group is called Drift. In this particular one, I'm really taking that same thing of kind of bunching up these pieces and making them kind of topsy-turvy. They kind of flow, but they're flowing in a different way. And they're just sort of, for the most part, if not the very center of the piece, they're kind of near the center of it. And again, drift is another word that I do think about my words a lot. I probably could have been a poet in another life, but I will spend a long time on these title series, so I'll just write it. This is it. This is the phrase that captures this, And that one word, drift, is very much the feeling I have of what's going on in the countryside right now, or what used to be the countryside. Because, to be honest with you, from my background, I'm kind of a nature guy. I lived in those areas, but I worked in the Forest Service for many years. Much of my 20s was up in the mountains. I used to fight forest fires and all. So to me, it's really hurtful to see what's happening to the countryside. It really is. So when I see all this, when I come up and down and seeing what's going on in New Jersey in particular, anything near that turnpike, just in the years that I've been going up and down that turnpike, it's shocking to me how much is being covered now with cement and these buildings and more highways and stuff like that. Again, we've all heard the spiel, right? We all got that naturalism in us, but I'm just telling you, when I use that word drift, I really mean drift, that we truly are drifting from one world to another world right now, and that drift is highly geometric, it's highly engineered. It's very much an engineered world. Yeah.
Working titles for your next show, get my drift.
Well, actually, that would be better for my next board game. So with board games, I'm sort of allowed a little more humor in it, like take a load off. Think about that for a few minutes. Yeah.
You know what strikes me with your work? It's the paradox. You're taking something
so obviously ugly. That's really against your brain.
Mhm.
Something that disturbs you,
Right.
and you're turning it into something absolutely beautiful. And that paradox is always
Yeah.
interesting me, how one can take inspiration from anything
Right.
that could be really, really totally the opposite of what really makes you tick, but it makes you tick in a way to create something
Yeah.
that is beautiful.
Right.
Turn it
Right.
around.
I think about that.
White into black and black into white.
Yeah. No,
So
it's,
that's
yeah, you're right. And I mean, I think, kind of many different people have many different definitions of art. I mean, I always find that so many people are into art. They call themselves artists, or they love the arts and all this. But if you literally have to answer, well, would you define art for me? And almost no one can do it. They would really stumble for a long time. Some people could. They have their sense, but you'd really have a huge range. We all know that. But let's face it, one of the, I think, enduring, if you have to pick one or two phrases that would define art, it's called a transformation. You're affecting a transformation of something, right? Even if it's simply a bunch of pigment that came out of the tube. You're affecting a transformation, especially if you're an inspired artist, you should, when you're done, this raw material should be this. So in a sense, I'm just playing the same game that millions of other artists have done. I'm trying to affect a transformation on something that actually sickens me on some levels, but yet fascinates me on other levels. And that's kind of what I'm doing. You're absolutely right. Sometimes I even wonder about myself on that one. Should I be more hardcore? Should I show the real ugliness of it all? In some ways, I sort of do, because if you go to my videos, by the way, my website, you can see a couple of videos I produced. It's a little bit more of the real raw thing, okay? So that's the medium for me to kind of hit it head on without too much grittiness going on. But yes, I'm very mindful of the fact that, at the end of the day, I'm a painter.